Okay, I will make a start now. My name's Slusan Mackenzie, and this is an insight conversation hosted by the Emergency Services Foundation. It is being recorded and will be available afterwards. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on all the lands that we're on today on this gorgeous Melbourne Day. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging as we discuss this really important topic of tackling stigma. It's time to tackle stigma. 2 years ago, Beyond Blue released its Answering the Call survey of 21,000 people across the nation who were emergency service workers. Overall, that survey found that mental health issues are common in the police and the emergency services, but that individuals, teams and organisations don't always seek the help they need or support each other as well as they could. And stigma and mental health conditions are the major barrier to seeking appropriate support in a timely way when it's needed. That's a really big problem because we know that the earlier we recognise a problem and the sooner we get good help, the more likely we are to recover. And that's what's really important. The Emergency Services Foundation works to improve mental health and wellbeing of people across the sector, people serving and post-serving. And we're focused on being proactive. So that is preventing mental ill health in the first place. And that's why this is such an important topic for us. So we've got three really fantastic speakers today that you can see on the screen. They're soon going to blank themselves out when I'm not speaking to them, but I'll introduce them to you as we go along. I would ask you, if you've got questions, to put them in the Q&A section at the bottom, and I will do my best to get to those questions. But how we do these insight conversations is that they're very informal, and I will ask questions to each of the speakers and we'll go like that. So we've got a great group of people attending today that I can see, and so that's fantastic. So I'm going to start with Lisa. So maybe if Chris and Cliff mute their video and themselves, that would be great. So let's start with Lisa. So Lisa's a senior researcher at Phoenix, Australia. So most of you will be aware that's the Centre for Post-Traumatic Mental Health, and they're a national leader in military, veteran and high-risk worker mental health. And of course, the emergency services are considered high-risk workers. She holds a PhD in psychology, has specialised in military, veteran and high-risk worker research for 15 years, and has published loads of papers, 65 I think, on this topic. And most importantly, the work that she does seems to translate very well to action. And that's why we're really interested in working with Lisa, and she is doing some research for the Emergency Services Foundation at the moment. So welcome, Lisa.
Thank you. Thank you, Susan. Thanks for having me today.
Pleasure. And I'm going to start by asking you the very basic question. What is mental health stigma?
Sure. So stigma has been studied a lot. So if anyone just pops the term stigma into Google or stigma and mental health, you'll get millions of responses. It's actually been studied a lot in the literature. And to be honest, it's quite a complicated construct, both to define and to measure. So often when people hear the term stigma, what they think about is what others will think about them. So people might think I am weak. People might think that I can't do my job. People think I'm not cut out for this role. But stigma is not only about what we think others think, it's also about what we ourselves think. So if I put my hand up and say I've got a problem, then I might feel weak, or I might feel like I'm letting the team down, or I won't be able to do this job, or I might not be able to advance in my career. And even though the reality might be that people are not saying negative things, stigma makes us afraid that they have or that they might. So stigma manifests as a worry and a fear in people. what we know from the literature is that people are particularly worried as well about people who are in supervisory or managerial roles, so people who are perceived to be in a position of power. And we also know that individuals in the workplace are really worried about what their peers might think. So they don't want to be letting them down, and they certainly don't want their peers to be thinking less of them. And, you know, Susan, you've mentioned that report, the big national study by Beyond Blue, and it's really interesting, the findings that came out of that, because the large majority of people said that they actually didn't hold stigmatizing attitudes towards colleagues who had challenges with mental health. But interestingly as well, there were quite high rates of feeling self-stigma, so feeling that you might let people down, or feeling worried about your career or your role. So what the data is showing us is that we're saying, well, I would be really understanding towards any of my peers or colleagues that have mental health challenges, but I'm not sure that my peers would be, so I won't speak up. So it's a tricky construct, you know, because what the literature is telling us on one hand, and then what we're seeing in the workplace isn't quite marrying up just at this point in time. So it's a difficult one to really nail. But I think if we think of it as a worry and a fear about our own beliefs and how we think others perceive us, that's probably a nice way to start forward.
Okay, thanks, Lisa. We're going to come back to Lisa. we're now going to go to Cliff Overton. Now, Cliff's from Healesville, and he started as a CFA volunteer in 1998, and then he worked for CFA in a corporate role starting in 2000. When Black Saturday happened, he responded both as a volunteer firefighter and in the aftermath as an employee. That exposure to trauma affected him deeply, and it took him 7 years to sort himself out. And sadly, only after leaving work in this sector was he able to get well. In 2020, he spoke at CFA's Black Saturday Memorial Service, after which he decided that he could do more to help others who were affected like him by their emergency service activities. And he's now a Beyond Blue lived experience speaker, and he's recorded a podcast with Beyond Blue that talks about his experience with PTSD. And it's a really powerful podcast, so I'd encourage you to listen to that if you want to learn a bit more, because my questions today of Cliff are very specific to stigma. But it's really important in this issue to speak to people who are willing to speak about their mental health issues to help reduce the stigma. So, Cliff, thank you very much for coming on and talking to us today.
Thank you.
I just realised 2000, that was when I was at CFA too, wasn't it? So we go back a very long way. So Cliff's still an active volunteer with Healesville Brigade, and I guess days like today start making people feel a bit anxious again with the wind out there and the warmth. So thinking back to Black Saturday, Cliff, and how it affected you, how did mental health stigma really first present itself to you?
Look, for me, Susan, it was this fear of not being allowed to continue doing what I was doing to help service and support the community. And the first instance that I recognised there was something going wrong with me, my greatest fear was if I presented that to my organisation, I would be put aside or told, well, gee, you have to go and get better now, you'd better stop working, which is now makes absolute common sense. But at the time, my greatest fear was, no, we've been hit hard. I need to do everything I possibly can for the Victorian community to try and make up for what just happened. So as Lisa just so beautifully put it, you know, I was building my own self-stigma as fast as I could build it in my own mind, and really not opening myself up to the very real opportunities that the CFA would have provided to me for me to get better at the time.
So how did that impact on you?
In all the ways that post-traumatic stress can manifest itself over time and over 7 years. Look, I was noticed as being highly anxious and contacted by the CFA psychiatrist at the time and told to take some leave, which I did. I undertook the free sessions, as it was called at the time, and back then I think there was a challenge where CFA would say, here's 5 free sessions, go and see what's going on with yourself. So
was that with the EAP, Chris?
Yeah, look, and so you almost felt an obligation to get better in 5 sessions, and if you didn't, then that was it. So I took those, and about another 8 months later I had physical manifestations of stress and anxiety. So I actually went and saw another psychiatrist through CFA who specialised in returned servicemen and women from overseas. So they had a good military background. But once again, it didn't work for me. My challenge was that I was compartmentalising myself away from the actual treatment. So I wasn't actually present in any of the treatment I was receiving. I was presenting somebody else at the time and keeping myself distant from it. So I carried this stigma of always having to present a brave face and be fine and do the work and carry on and support the community. But at the same time, I was not allowing myself to be vulnerable and open up and actually, receive the care I needed.
So how many people did you see before you eventually found someone that you clicked with?
Look, it was the first 2 that were through where I worked at the time. And then, I worked at CFA, and then I went and worked at MFB, and then I worked at VFBV. So I think that's all the emergency service acronyms I can think of for working at. And I reached a point where my condition was so severe that I was contemplating suicide and planning suicide. And I recognised that in myself. As you said before, I fronted up to my employer at the time and told them what was wrong and I needed to leave the sector. Took the time out, didn't work, and happened to live next door to a psychiatric service at the time. So I literally wandered in the door, got a GP referral, started talking to someone, and it was only fortunate for me that clicked, and there was no time pressure. There were no constraints. I was able to do it at my own time. It took 8 months of sessions when I was ready to have them. This was fully supported by CFA, who even though I was no longer an employee, they covered the costs of those sessions and supported me. So that was a wonderful piece of support. But once again, it was at my own time. I wasn't an active volunteer at the time. I had no other work pressures, and I was able to take the time and finally deal with some issues.
Okay. So, Cliff, for you, what was the source of the stigma? What do you think was at the root cause of it for you?
I think I love working for CFA and fully embraced the purpose, the identity, the culture, the values, the history, everything about it, and literally lived, ate and breathed service to the Victorian community. When we went through Black Saturday, at the end of that, I felt that everything I had done for the previous years in relation to improving community safety and providing community with potential solutions to the threat of a bushfire had failed 173 people, and it was my personal fault. I decided at the time, no, that Black Saturday was my fault, and that I needed to do something to make it up to these people. And so I just worked as hard as I could, and continually worked, and literally to the point where I happened to be present in a car service centre when a gentleman had a stroke and collapsed, and I was able to do the appropriate first aid and save his life. And I ticked off in my head, that's 1 down, 172 to go. I still have a debt to Victoria. So I just carried that. My initial presentation, I think, to myself was everything I ever aspired to be as part of CFA had just been thrown back at me, and I'd failed.
Okay. So what role does the culture of an organisation have in creating stigma?
Yeah, it's as Lisa said before, there's a real two-way. It's the stigma you bring yourself to the table and the stigma that's present at the table when you arrive. there is still a latent, and it's gendered too because of the nature of the makeup of the organisations historically, but there is a heroic, macho, never show fear, never show weakness, never show humility. There is a latent aspect of that to our organisations. A lot of it's, I think a lot of it's just perpetuated by our media, in that we promote these heroes to the community that wear these, you know, superhero costumes and go out and undertake heroic deeds. It was fascinating for me that the chief officer at the time, back in 2020, when I spoke, he said to me how incredibly brave I was to speak. And I thought, well, that's really, really great to hear, because it doesn't matter how many things I've done off the back of a fire truck to support the Victorian community in a traditional heroic sense, as perpetuated by the, you know, firefighter mythology. I've just been complimented on doing something heroic entirely out of context, you know, speaking out about my vulnerability. So yeah, I think we still have a challenge. I think increasing diversity in the workforce is going to help that. I think increasing awareness across the sector through our organisations, our volunteer associations, our union bodies. If it's one thing that I'm hearing consistently, it's that they are all saying we need to do more work in this area. There is no conflict.
No. I agree with you 100% about that heroic model. And every time I hear that word used in the media, it makes me shudder, because I think people say it with the best intentions, but they don't realise that what it's actually doing to people who might be struggling. Thinking back to Black Saturday, Cliff, what would you do differently, knowing, you know, for your personal well-being, knowing what you know now?
I think I would have greater faith in my organisation to work with me and acknowledge the fact that I was unwell and that I may need to take a temporary leave of doing what I love doing, but the reassurance would have been there that I could return to it if I had wanted to return to it. But at the time, my greatest fear was that I would be, you know, made redundant, put aside, you know, less of a man because I couldn't continue to contribute to community safety. So there was certainly a lot of that inside myself that, looking back now, you know, I've experienced post-traumatic growth, so I've grown from the experience, and I would trust in my organisation and those around me, my peers and my friends, to work with me rather than the fear of them working against me.
Well, I agree with you, Chief Officer Cliff. You've been incredibly brave, and it's an incredible journey you've been on. We'll come back to you. I want to go back to Lisa now. Thank you, Cliff. Lisa, what are some of the key factors that we know contribute to stigma? We've heard Cliff's ideas from lived experience, which is clearly very powerful. But from your work, you know, what are some of the key factors?
Yeah, absolutely. Very powerful story, Cliff. You know, thank you for sharing. And actually, you've touched on so many of the things that I had thought to talk about today, and really underscored, I guess, the real experience. So I certainly really appreciate you sharing that. You know, as I alluded to earlier, we know that a lot of research has been done in trying to understand stigma and where it comes from. You know, Cliff's touched on some of those already. We know that stigma can arise out of fear of what others might think, fear of what I value for myself, fear of losing my job, you know, fear of losing opportunity, feeling embarrassed, ashamed, that sense of failure that Cliff picked up on there as well. And these kinds of things, they fit in with other barriers to help seeking that we know of as well. You know, again, and Cliff, you've done a lovely job of, you know, introducing this section for us. So around help seeking, when people are thinking about accessing services, people sometimes think services are too hard to access, or they don't understand enough about different services and what they do. So they might not understand what would actually happen in an appointment with a mental health specialist. We know from a lot of our work in the military, especially, that individuals worry about what they'll have to say and do in an appointment. They worry that the person who they're going to see won't understand their job. They won't understand the pressures that they're faced that are very unique to these high-risk occupations. Or we know that people worry about having to tell their life story or relive a childhood experience. And if you're someone who's not doing very well, then the last thing that you want to do is go to see somebody who you think might make you have to revisit a lot of stressful events. And so all of these factors sort of combine, the fears about yourself, the fears about what you think other people will think, fears about the unknown. Those are the things that we know contribute to stigma and that really present a barrier to people getting help.
Very interesting. What about, is there anything in particular about emergency service workers, the way stigma can manifest itself?
Yes, there are a few things, and it's similar to what we see in the military and veteran populations. So again, there's a lot of parallels with those groups. So we know that when we've talked to people from these organisations that they tend to feel less support, or they perceive that they have less support in the organisation after going through these events. And Cliff again touched on that, particularly in the piece where he was reflecting back, you know, if it was now, how would he approach it? That recognition that actually there is a lot of support within those organisations. But what we know is that often there is a sense that they may not be well supported, or they may be moved on. And these careers, you know, we talked about the word hero, but these careers that are very important for our community as well, there's a lot of pressure that goes with that. So there's, again, the additional higher levels of job strain that we know comes with working in these organisations. So if we know that stigma can lead to feeling a lack of support and feeling more isolated, and we know it can lead to strain, then that presents sort of a triangle of challenges for us to manage. And that's really present in the emergency service space as well. You know, we know that as problems emerge, that can disrupt relationships and supports and lead to isolation and withdrawal. And we know in these environments, they're often faced with challenging work-life balance anyway, with shift work and having to go away from home for periods of time. So there are some quite unique factors actually from within emergency services that can contribute.
Yeah. So why is research into stigma? I mean, there's been a lot of research, but I know we've talked about the fact that worldwide there's been a lot of research, but there's not been much change.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. You know, and similar, you know, we see similar in the general community as to what we see in high risk or these frontline organisations, which is that stigma drives a lack of health service utilisation. And, you know, it's great to be raising awareness about stigma. It's great to be having all of these different campaigns. But what we really need to be understanding is in the here and now what we should be targeting. So it's wonderful to have spokespeople stand up and talk about their experiences, and that's really important and very validating as well. But we also need to be mindful that it's relatable for everybody in an organisation. So for example, with a very junior staff member, if they've only been employed or on the road for 6 months and they'll see somebody very senior talking about their own challenges with mental health, they might be thinking, well, he's been in the job 30 years. You know, he's seen it all. I can understand that, you know, he might be having some challenges. But for me, you know, I've only been on the road 6 months and I'm not coping. You know, am I not cut out for this? What's wrong? So research is actually really helping us understand that. And it's really helping us understand at the different points in the life cycle of a career of a member that different things actually are more effective.
Okay, so what are some of the interventions or programs that you found have helped reduce stigma?
Yeah, there's a lot out there. There's a lot of great stuff already out there. There's all the mental health awareness events, and Are You OK is a particularly strong campaign across the country. We know that there's Mental Health Week, special events and special speakers, but it's not just about those one-off events. So what we know is that you actually have to keep the discussion going so that people will hear it when they're ready to hear it. And we don't know when that will be. So it's really important to keep the dialogue going. You know, when it's not a conversation to just have at recruitment or initiation. That's when people are fresh off the bus, as it were, feeling excited, feeling pretty bulletproof about their career, not really thinking about mental health and stigma. So having those conversations then are important. But, when you're 18 and single and in your first job, it's pretty different to someone who's 25 years in, 45, on a second marriage, and, has been out on the road for 15 years. So we know that we need to keep the conversation going and keep it at the forefront of everybody's mind. It is a lot about organisational culture and leadership. And from that point of view, it's okay that agencies will tackle stigma or address stigma or communicate about stigma differently. That's actually really appropriate. With stigma, there isn't really any hard science about a one-size-fits-all. So organisations having a multi-pronged approach where you think about peer support programs, mental health screening, self-help apps, team or unit meetings and socialisation. It's all about facilitating the ability for people to self-manage and making sure there's plenty of opportunity in the career life cycle for them to do so.
Okay. So what about, what can individuals, families and peers do about stigma?
Yeah, sure. So firstly, with individuals, it's about looking after yourself and your well-being, and really, I think it's good to bring in the early intervention piece. So understanding some of those early signs and symptoms of mental health issues. So this is where we need some more education as well in the workforce, is, when those first few symptoms start emerging, or those first challenges start emerging about things that we know can contribute to mental health challenges, such as sleep issues or emotional management issues, or relationship or social support starting to fall apart, or, starting to turn to alcohol as a way of coping. So we really want to empower people that when they first see those changes in themselves, that's a good time to reach out to your GP and have a chat, because everything we know about early identification and intervention, it really tells us that these early signs and symptoms are just much easier to manage than letting them go and potentially having them manifest into something that's quite a bit more serious. So from an individual point of view, I'd really be thinking about early intervention and education around those early signs and symptoms that arise. In terms of families, so families are a really interesting piece. They're often the people who notice changes first, oftentimes before their family member notices them, so before the member actually notices them. So they'll notice if their partner is starting to have a change in sleep, or if they're more disconnected, or if there's a potential that they're drinking more. It's in the home environment that we start to see those changes. So it's really important that families are armed with information as well, that they know what resources are out there. So family sessions or information evenings, and again, not done just once, but keeping those conversations going. And interestingly, what we've seen a lot in our work with the military is a group that's often missed out in terms of the families are the parents of the member themselves. So, we know that when people become quite unwell, if their immediate relationship falls apart, it's often the parents who are picking up the pieces, and it's often the parents that are then involved. And typically they're not a group that are engaged early in this conversation.
Very good. Yeah.
So that's definitely a few ideas. And then with peers, I think peers are an extremely important group. Peers really do keep us engaged. It's not just the job of the leader to look out for the team. It's actually everybody's responsibility. And there's a program that some people are probably well aware of in the military that's called Keep Your Mates Safe. And that program, it has a few different focuses and often at the more severe end of mental health problems. But the basic premise of that program is that we're all responsible for looking out for each other. And if you see or notice some change, you need to reach out and check in, and recognizing that person, they might not be the best company at the moment, and they might not be in the best headspace because of how they're feeling, but actually that's when we need to really actively reach out. And I think really active support when we're first noticing some changes should come from peers, we know through the literature that peers are very credible, they're trusted, and they're often relied upon. Everybody's got each other's back. So they actually, within the workplace, they actually play a really critical role.
So it's really interesting. I mean, I obviously am aware of this, but could you share with people listening today how we are using that knowledge of what you've talked about in this piece of research that you're doing with ESF and the sector in Victoria now?
Sure.
Because, we don't want to do just another piece of research. We don't want to repeat what's out there. We want to do something that is absolutely going to help us deliver something of benefit to people on the ground.
Definitely. So, yeah, it's a really exciting piece of work that we're doing with ESF, actually. There, as I've said, there's been quite a lot of research done into stigma, but a missing piece sort of within Australia in particular is actually talking to members of those organisations. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to have conversations with over 50 different emergency service workers and really ask them about help seeking and stigma, and what are those early symptoms that they identify in people that they work with. How do they think people should be able to access supports? Are there better ways that they could be accessing support? And what kind of messaging should organisations be giving, and when might those key touch points be to be hearing that messaging? So everything we've talked about, we know it's important, but actually we really need to validate that through talking to the individuals on the ground, to people like Cliff, to understand at the time that you were experiencing those first initial signs where you were, not feeling great, what would have helped you then? So we're going to talk to people who are in their mid to sort of late career, just to understand from their point of view what they think would be optimal ways to help people get support, and to understand what's the best way to have the messaging within organisations. So it's a really innovative study, to be honest. Nobody's really looked at it in this sample in Australia, so we're pretty excited to see what comes of that. And Susan, be great to share that with this group. I mean, I know we're sharing it with you, but be great to come back and share that with this group and just talk about what we've found.
We will be absolutely doing that. And the other group, of course, that we're targeting in that is support staff, because what we've found is, so often it's the frontline people who are involved in these studies in the emergency services. So we decided, because of issues around vicarious trauma and so forth, that we wanted to approach the support staff as well. So for those of you who don't know, that's a piece of work that's currently with Ethics at Melbourne Uni. We have no reason to believe it's not going to pass that, and we will be starting that very soon. Just one more question on that, Lisa. When I was speaking to a firefighter the other day, he said to me, well, you're not talking to many people as part of the study. So we're doing focus groups and then we're doing one-on-one interviews. So can you explain why our numbers are actually valid?
Yes, certainly. So this is a qualitative research design, which means, as Susan said, we're running a set of interviews and then a number of focus groups as well. And everything we know about qualitative research is that once you've talked to enough people, you start to reach saturation, as in no new information starts to come to light. So you start to hear the same thing over and over, and there's nothing new to add in. So we know from qualitative research that we tend to hit saturation at numbers that are quite a bit lower than people would expect. So usually anywhere between about 12 and 18, depending on what you're talking about, is when we would start to reach saturation. So we know that from the plethora of literature that is out there. And so what we've aimed to do is, because we're targeting people at different stages in their career, and as Susan alluded to, we're also talking with corporate staff as well. We wanted to make sure the study had sufficient power within each of those groups to be able to pick up on any differences that might come out just by virtue of being mid-career, late career, or as a corporate staff member. So that's why we're running up to 60, we'll be talking to up to 60 individuals, but certainly in terms of the rigor of the design, this is very well accepted as standard within the research. And we do have the capacity where we can talk to a few extra people if we need to, if we find we're not reaching saturation by the time we hit 15 or 16 people, we can take that up to 20 people. So the design is certainly well accepted in the scientific community.
Thank you. Thanks, Lisa. Somebody's just put Stacey's just put a comment, great news about their support employees, because people often have survivor guilt that they're not at the front line. So I was very pleased when the group who sort of designed this decided that was a group they wanted to target. So
absolutely.
Thank you.
No problem. Thank you, Susan.
We'll come back. If anybody's got any questions, please put them in the Q&A. So I'm going to go to Dr. Chris Groot now, who is the Director of Mental Illness Stigma Lab at the Melbourne School of Psychological Sciences. So his lab investigates the determinants of stigma around severe and complex mental health problems, such as schizophrenia, spectrum disorders, borderline personality, and so forth. And you might think, well, what does that have to do with the emergency services? Well, Chris is going to tell us that in a moment. He's the research lead on the National Stigma Report Card, which is a research and advocacy project conducted by SANE Australia. And ESF is very much hoping to work with SANE Australia in setting up a lived experience network. We've got all fingers and toes crossed that we get some funding for that. So Dr. Groot has also led the clinical and research aspects of many large-scale telephone and online mental health services, including the Beyond Blue info line, Suicide Line Victoria, suicide callback service, and so forth, and specialised in services for the Defence Force. So welcome, Chris. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, thanks so much for having me along.
Yeah. So first of all, what is the National Stigma Report Card?
That's a very good question. It's been wonderful to listen to Lisa and Cliff and to reflect on this National Stigma Report Card that we've just launched recently, and hear how all of these efforts and the efforts of ESF really align very well. Lots of the work that Lisa was describing that she's done is very complementary to the work that we've done in this, as the name suggests, national project, where we have wanted to investigate the experience of stigma and its behavioural manifestation, discrimination, for Australians who live with severe and complex mental health issues. So with SANE Australia, the Melbourne School of Psychological Sciences at the at the University of Melbourne, where Lisa's also a staff member, we got together and reflected on what's been done in the Australian landscape around investigating the experience of being stigmatised and being discriminated against, and really reflected on the fact that Beyond Blue has done so much wonderful work over a very long period of time. Obviously has done some really large scale research with the emergency services in recent years as well. And we've been talking about self-stigma and so forth, and stigma within the organisations just now. And our hypothesis was, I think, fundamentally based on international observations and predominantly from the Time to Change stigma reduction program in the UK, was that the experience of stigma and discrimination is probably going to be different for people who live with conditions like schizophrenia, for example, when compared to people who might live with mild to moderate anxiety or depression. Indeed, it was almost a year ago to the day that Georgie Harmon and Michelle Blanchard and I were on a panel speaking about this observation we'd had that perhaps inadvertently through the last 20 years of really great work from Beyond Blue, we've created a dichotomy, a false dichotomy, where anxiety and depression have become sort of culturally sanctioned experiences of mental health problems, yet psychoses, personality disorders, eating disorders, trauma-related disorders, and so forth have receive less attention, are poorly understood, and remain relatively stigmatized. So we conducted a national survey. We recruited just under 2,000 people who lived with severe and complex mental health issues, and asked them about how they experienced stigma and discrimination across 14 areas of life. So we really wanted to see how this played out across the complexity of life. And certainly one of the areas in which we investigated stigma and discrimination was health services and mental health services, including access to emergency services. But we looked at everything from relationships through to education, employment, being in a public space, being in a community group, and so forth. And the idea is that based on the findings and the report that we've just released and the findings we're continuing to generate, we now start working with peak organizations from each of those 14 areas to try and improve the situation for people with lived experience. And then we intend to keep doing follow-up measurements. So we've got another national survey planned for 2 years' time. And hopefully we can keep this ball rolling and start to monitor stigma reduction around severe and complex presentations. And as Lisa said, the effort really needs to be sustained. Short-lived campaigns we know are not effective. That Time to Change program I mentioned in the UK, with a lot of Graham Thornycroft's work, they've demonstrated they've provided really good evidence that shows reductions in stigmatized attitudes and prejudicial emotions towards people living with mental health problems. Unfortunately, they've just announced that they've lost funding in the COVID era and they're going to discontinue. But I digress. So in a nutshell, it's a very large, comprehensive research and targeted advocacy program.
Okay, so based on the findings from that report card, are people living with these complex mental health issues likely to use emergency services when they need them?
Yeah, that was one of the most concerning findings from the report card. So no is the answer. It's mixed, it's variable. So there's a few things here that I might mention. We indexed a range of mental health experiences, and we found that the group of people that reported more stigma and discrimination than any other group, clinically speaking, were people living with borderline personality disorder. And this was in the healthcare and mental health care systems. They reported more stigma than others. Across the entire sample, we actually saw this pervasive pattern of experiences of past discrimination or unfair treatment, perceived unfair treatment and perceived discrimination in healthcare services, followed by anxious anticipation and fearful anticipation of future such experiences, and then withdrawal from opportunity as a result, withdrawal from help seeking mental health services in this case. And we saw that over 80% of the sample indicated that in the last 12 months, they had not called 000 or reached out for emergency care when they needed it because of fear of being stigmatized or being discriminated against.
So what's needed to provide emergency services to people living with those complex issues then? What do the emergency services need to do?
That's it's a great question. And I think that, I've lost my screen. Where are we here? I think that Lisa's already touched on some really wonderful suggestions regarding what organisations can do to support frontline mental health workers. Certainly, some of the presentations, obviously, that occur in an emergency setting are very challenging, and indeed in another project that I've just wound up in collaboration with SANE, Australia again, and On the Line and Lifeline, we've been looking at how specific symptoms and elements of presentations in an emergency setting to a telephone counselling service tend to elicit stigma from telephone counsellors, from crisis counsellors. And we were expecting that threats of suicide risk, for example, threats of suicide would be something that would increase stigma in a stigmatised response from counsellors, but we actually found nothing there. And in the context of a suicide prevention service, that sort of makes sense. If a client is presenting with suicide risk, then one feels like that, I suppose that's where you're operating, that's where your service is, that feels right. But what was eliciting more stigma was difficult interpersonal characteristics that might be typical of a presentation from somebody, for example, with borderline personality disorder, who's in a crisis state. And so we've started now working on translating these findings into improved service models, and some of the things that we've been discussing have been things like really understanding, helping staff to understand, better educating staff around the constituent features of crisis presentations, and leading people, helping people to understand that so many of these features are actually part of a disorder, part of an illness, rather than somebody necessarily being annoying or being manipulative for the sake of being manipulative, for example, and could be seen through the lens of a health problem rather than a personality problem, for example.
I'm not sure if this happens or not. Somebody might be able to say something in the chat to correct me. But is there a place in the training of emergency services? Let's say, you know, firefighters going through their training or police going through their training to really help them understand these different issues?
There absolutely is. So some of the things we're building in, and indeed some of the things we've built into our psychology, undergraduate psychology program at the University of Melbourne recently, has been more explicit education around these sorts of presentations, and also the opportunity to interact with people with lived experience outside of a crisis setting. So what is really fundamental to build empathy and to build compassion is to have contact with somebody that has lived experience of a mental health problem and who may at other times present in a crisis setting. If we can interact with those people at other times, not during crisis, and have the experience of being with that person, of speaking with that person and realizing that they're having a really tough time, that's a great way to build empathy, to draw out that human compassion.
Yeah.
The education bit is about replacing, I suppose, assumption and cultural myth with factual information. And that varies according, as Lisa said, this is such a complex issue. You know, around an issue like schizophrenia, for example, a very common misled stereotype is that everybody with schizophrenia is inherently violent. And we know this is not the case. This is a very commonly held belief in the general public, because that's what, you know, media and whether it's mass news media or creative works have conditioned us to believe. Yet other conditions like borderline personality disorder, for example, they're just not known. Around 5% of the population might know roughly what exactly borderline personality disorder is.
So where can people find out more about the stigma report card, Chris?
So the stigma report card, if you go to nationalstigmareportcard.com.au, that is a site that's hosted by SANE. There's the full report, summary reports. There's a data explorer where you can have a look at the data geographically. You can see the breakdown of the nearly, as I said, the nearly 2,000 people's responses to every single question in the Our Turn to Speak survey. And for, of course, everybody out there is very interested in emergency services. You'll be able to read a couple of chapters worth that will be certainly interesting for you around healthcare services, mental health care services, and people's experiences of stigma and discrimination in those areas.
Okay, thank you. Cliff, I've got a question for you. Maybe both Cliff and Lisa will come back online now, but Cliff, you heard Lisa talking about the research that ESF is doing. How confident are you in the sector being able to translate and that research and turning it into something that's going to be very helpful for people on the ground?
I was sitting back thinking that, actually. I was thinking, I have a very high degree of confidence in our emergency sector at both a station level, and I think that's quite specific when we talk about the way teams who operate at brigade, station, unit level and act as peers and support each other. I have high degree of confidence in their ongoing interest in this topic and their capacity to learn and improve how they look after each other. And then I also have a high degree of confidence in our executive managers and controllers of these organisations to recognise this and support it cross-sector as well.
Okay, we haven't had one question from anyone, which I find astounding. So if anybody's got a question, pop it in now. Lisa, would you have any concluding remarks that you would like to make?
Yeah, just that, we've touched on how complex an area this is, why the research is important. I think it's also really important to acknowledge how the face of the workplace has changed, and that, strategies, interventions, programs that might have been really relevant and effective, 30, 20, even 10 years ago, like the face of the employee has changed. Technology has changed. Access to information is readily at our fingertips on our phones with the click of a button. And so I think that that's really an important part of the research, is to keep on top of all these novel and unique ways that people can access help. People are much keener on looking after their own health and well-being. And that's made much easier nowadays with all the apps and, even telehealth that we've seen emerge, quite strongly through the COVID pandemic. I just think it's really interesting to recognise the change in the workplace. And, Cliff, you alluded to that a little bit as well, very male-dominated industries traditionally, we're starting to see women come up in through those workforces in the military and in emergency services. And that brings, another level of complexity as well when you get women who are pregnant in the workforce, or women who have got children at home, or who are managing a house. We have a lot more single parent families now. So I guess my conclusion is that despite the fact that we've researched stigma for many, many years, I think we need to really respect and appreciate that we need to keep doing so. I don't think that there's going to be a panacea for stigma. I think it's really about us keeping on top of what workers need now and what's the best way to be able to reach out to them. And that changes as time changes.
Cliff, would you like to make a concluding statement or comment?
I will, because I guess a while back I thought my story was over, but it actually continues. And it was only last fire season in Gippsland. I was away with a strike team, part of a crew in the back of a fire truck. And we were tasked with something that was highly reminiscent of me for Black Saturday and may have impacted me at the time. Now, being able to talk openly in the truck with the crew and the crew leader about our tasking, what we were facing, what it might mean for us and what that would result in was amazing, because it was a very, very strong sense of team. You could be vulnerable about your condition, you could have those conversations, and you could actually successfully plan out how you were going to work together to look after each other. So I came away from that 5-6 days down in Buchan with that on my mind more than anything else we'd done. And I thought, if that's just one small example about how crews, teams, stations, platoons, however we create these groups and operate, can actually be open and talk and look after each other, then yeah, I'm very confident about where we're going.
Do you think that happened to you and that strike team, Cliff, because people were aware of the fact of how unwell you'd been?
Possibly, because I had previously had a conversation with one of the people on that crew at our station 12 months prior about my background. I mean, CFA is a small world, so it doesn't take much for someone to go, oh, you're the guy. So that may have alluded to it, but I also think that person could have totally forgotten about that or not thought it to be important at the time. But the fact was, the four of us in the truck at the time recognised the importance of the conversation.
Very good. And Chris, would you like to make a final statement or comment?
Where are we here? There we go. Oh, look, I think I'm just so impressed by everything I'm hearing about the considerations of the consideration of stigma within emergency services and protecting our emergency services staff from the effects of stigma and all of that internalized stigma that comes with being in the type of elite institutions that emergency services are. And I thought I might finish by just commenting that like Lisa highlighted the importance of qualitative data, the report card is beyond a survey, full of qualitative data that doesn't only speak to negative experiences, there's also positive experiences to be read there around emergency services. So if you would like to hear about people's positive experiences in using emergency services, then please also check that out.
Okay, well, I'll finish up now and I'll say thank you to Cliff, Lisa and Chris. What a fabulous conversation and wonderful insight that you've all shared. People's beliefs and capability is definitely an enabler for them to good mental health. So we must all collaborate to remove the stigma which currently exists. And I'm a firm believer that people talk about stigma, but they don't really understand the complexity of it. They have a very simple view of what stigma is. So if you know someone who's missed this conversation, please tell them to go to our website, esf.com.au tomorrow, and we'll have a recording up there, and just look in the news section and they can check it out. So thank you for joining us today. Take care, stay safe, enjoy the sunshine and enjoy your freedom. Okay, thank you very much, and thank you everyone.
Thanks all.
Thank you, bye.
Thank you.